A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
Hey, they've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, the Horrible, Deplorable himself, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Welcome, by the way, to the Gab community. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, the405media.com, where we play at 5 p.m. on Saturday and Sundays. So I know what's on everybody's minds because we're doing this podcast on a Thursday, as we usually do. And last night, the world blew up because of a supposed deal between the president and Schumer and Pelosi on the DACA. So-called dreamers, the children brought here illegally, who are now upwards of 24 to 36 years old. Most of you are following that. You don't need me to run down the overview or all the details, but just to briefly say there's this concern that Trump has made a deal to pass a DACA, clean DACA bill, and that he won't get anything for it, or that he'll get something very minor like border security, which will be ill-defined, or that will be a afterthought, and that, you know, the DACA amnesty will occur, and who knows if the border security ever will. I just want to share two thoughts on this, because it's still very fresh, and we do go through these cycles of hyperventilation on social media, and I want to bring a reality check to that. First of all, the president has never betrayed us. I would remind people to think back on the last 8 months of who's actually been delivering on his promises and doing far more than we could have hoped for, and who hasn't. And it's the worthless GOP in the House and the Senate that have killed nearly everything. They've gotten almost nothing done. They're going to try to hang their hat on the fact that they got Judge Gorsuch on the Supreme Court as their lone accomplishment for the year, which is just pathetic. And there may be tax cuts passed this year, but that will only be because the Chamber of Commerce wanted that, and the whole nationalist agenda has been completely thwarted by the worthless GOP in the House, and we have to come for those people next year. Trump is the executive. He's not able to pass bills on the legislative side, and he's done a lot that he's been capable of doing on the executive. I'm obviously not completely satisfied. I'd like to see things at an even more frantic pace, but still, he has not betrayed us on any significant issue, so there's no reason to believe that he's going to do that now. I'll be the first to criticize if that actually happens, but rather than constantly jumping into these cycles of hyperventilation, I choose to believe that the president has our back. Do I think he's playing 50D chess? No, I don't think he's playing 50D chess, but I don't know all of what's going on the inner circle, and I'm going to give you some clues as to why I think it's not what you think it is. First of all, I think Ann Coulter may be right that Chuck Schumer's more interested in trying to get the president to break a promise than he is in actually trying to make any deal. He's just trying to sow discontent because he doesn't have a lot of power to do anything else as a minority leader. But I would make this observation. In a real deal in which two people on opposite sides of the political spectrum have made a deal that may be dangerous for both of them, but that they think is in their best interest, they don't immediately go out and sabotage each other by making public statements that the other person can't defend. My point being that if Schumer and Pelosi had really made a deal with the president, they wouldn't immediately go out to the microphones and say, well, he's broken his promise to the base of the Republican Party on DACA, and he's told us he's going to pass a clean DACA bill, right? I mean, if they really had a deal to get a clean DACA bill, they wouldn't go out immediately and say something that would cause the firestorm that is caused, and the president's already tweeting that there's no deal. The White House spokesman, Sarah Sanders, was saying last night there's no deal. So that doesn't appear to me to be the actions of people who actually have a deal with the president. It seems more like what people would do who are just trying to sow discontent and to set fires behind enemy lines to cause havoc.
So why did the writer for Breitbart write what he did?
of course, they're freaking out. Ann Coulter's freaking out. And that's all good. That's all good. Because this goes to my second point, which is that just because in the end I trust the president doesn't mean that we don't all have our part to play as part of the political kabuki theater. And it is important. The president is monitoring social media. He is constantly taking the pulse of his base. And it's important that when these things come up, like immigration and amnesty for illegals, that there is for lack of a better term, a hysterical response. In other words, all the right people have to henny penny and claim the sky is falling. Breitbart needs to attack, Ann Coulter needs to attack, Mickey Klaus needs to attack. That needs to happen because Trump has to see that. He has to be constantly reminded that there is this boiling sea of rage, that supported him and that would pull the rug out from underneath him if he were to go in a different direction. Again, not that I think the president actually is. What I think the president does in a lot of these meetings is I think it's much more freewheeling. I think he is very pleasant and open to people, basically kind of open to suggestion. I think what he does is a lot of mirroring in meetings where people express their concerns and he confirms that he shares that concern, or people express their desire and he confirms that he also shares that desire. It's not necessarily dishonest. It's just more of a tactic to sort of have a pleasant meeting and to get on somebody's side. He's not a politician. I think politicians think of meetings as a minefield where they have to be very careful about what they're promising. But I don't think that Trump thinks that way. I think he's much more interested in just having a pleasant encounter with the person that he's having a meeting with, or to get along. We've seen this over the last year, that a lot of times people feel they've come out of meetings with some agreement with him, and they don't have an agreement with him. I guess what I'd say is we've been doing this now for 2 years, and we've seen the president in action, both as a candidate and as a president. And as I said, he has not betrayed us on a significant item. And there have constantly been these news cycles where there's been this thought that Trump's going in some direction that he was not going in. And so I would encourage everybody to play the long game and to see how things play out. Now, that's not to say that if you feel motivated to tweet or to gab or to post a column making it clear what a betrayal on DACA would mean for the president, which would basically ensure that he could not get reelected and all of that. I think those points are worth making. I think Trump sees some of this, when it gets to a certain level and there's hashtags out there about him betraying the base. Those things need to trend. That's all important because it's sort of part of the ocean of this political sea, and he needs to see and feel that, and that's all good. It's a nice reminder for him. But I am not in a place where I believe he's actually going to betray us. Now, just to wrap this all up with a bow on it, of course I agree that any deal to give amnesty to what they're claiming is 800, which will be closer to 2 million probably, 800,000 will be closer to 2 million people. It would be a travesty. It would be a huge mistake, because if you haven't changed the entire immigration system away from a chain migration system, then it's going to turn into millions more as family members are brought in. And I have said before on this podcast that the road to a good deal is just to keep deporting and keep deporting and keep deporting. The president has the power in the negotiations here to continue to make life unpleasant for the Democrats until they're willing to give him everything that we want. An end to birthright citizenship, a points-based legal immigration system that completely ends chain migration forever, and an end to H-1B visas and E-Verify, and it needs to be a crime when you are here illegally that prevents you from ever being able to apply for citizenship again. In exchange for all of that and a wall and all the rest, it might be worth a one-time deal to allow some of these people to stay, but you would have to get the whole panoply of items, which, by the way, I don't believe the Democrats are ever going to make that deal. So I just think that that's just never going to happen. So again, I would go back to my original point, which is the president has the power just to keep deporting, and he should do that. If there's any lame deal to legalize some or all of these children, it's a huge mistake for a number of reasons. One is, as I said, it will turn into a lot more illegals being legalized than any number that they're giving. And Coulter's absolutely right about that. But second of all, it's just the death of the entire anti-left movement, because for an entire year they couldn't get anything done for American citizens, and then they're going to get something done for illegals. Tactically, politically, it's a horrible mistake, which isn't to say that the Republicans won't do that, because they make tactical and horrible decisions all the time. But I will fret about that if and when it happens. I think that, the one upside of a Republican Congress that can get nothing done is apparently a Republican Congress that can get nothing done. So I have very little faith, and I mean that in a negative way, that they can actually get this done. I think too many people have at least the smallest instinct for self-preservation to not do something so insanely stupid. So I believe that a lot of what's going on is kabuki theater. Even Trump's tweets this morning that seem to be very sympathetic to DACA, he does that with some regularity. He will send out a tweet, which I think he expects to kind of go viral among the left, that softens his image and makes him seem like a good guy, or at least attempts to. But I don't think that it actually is policy. So we'll see how this plays out. We will stay on top of it. But if you have concerns, I completely endorse the idea of expressing those and making sure that you add your voice so that the president understands exactly where things need to go. Let's talk for a second about the forest fires that are occurring across the West. Just a few figures. 47,000 fires, 8 million acres burned, predominantly in California, Oregon, and Montana. 62 large fires throughout the West, even in North Dakota, across 9 western states, 17 of those in Oregon. The natural parks are threatened. Among the many that are threatened, the Crater Lake, which is Oregon's lone national park, is threatened. And I had some family that were visiting from out of state and went to see Crater Lake and could only see half of it because of all the smoke. Standing on the rim, they could only see half of that beautiful national park. I bring this all up to congratulate the environmental movement on their accomplishment this summer. These forests burn because we no longer log them. I guess it needs to be said again, but trees are not rocks. They don't last forever. These aren't ancient pictograms that you can preserve for thousands of years. The trees that live in Oregon, some of which might live up to 1,000 years, some of them, in the vast majority of cases will live a few hundred years, and then they will either rot, or they will burn, or they will fall down in a windstorm. But one way or another, they will not last. And what the environmental community has systematically done for the last 30 years is to destroy the logging industry in Oregon and other states under the guise of somehow preserving these natural wonders. Except that, as we're finding out, and as anybody with a brain understood, you cannot preserve natural wonders that are alive because they're going to die. And there's a cycle out there that they go through. Now, at its heyday, logging heyday in the early 80s, the zenith, Oregon logged about 12 billion board feet a year in timber. Half of that coming from private land, half of that coming from public land, the national forests. Today, the private harvest is about the same. It remains about 6 billion. The public harvest is somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 500 million board feet, down from 6 billion. So essentially, the public lands are locked out. And now they burn. And they release all of that carbon, which the environmentalists lie and claim they care about global warming and all of this. Well, everyone understands that forests are huge carbon sinks, and when you have these massive forest fires, all that carbon is released into the air. It's like a couple of volcanoes going off. So they clearly don't care about any of that, if you needed any more proof. It's injurious to the landscape. Part of what's happened is that we did so much fire suppression for so long that these forests are very thick, thicker than they ever were naturally, because fires used to come through naturally. The Indians would even set fires on occasion, and they are much thicker, they burn much hotter, they sterilize the soil. It's just an ecological catastrophe in every way, and it is entirely fault of the environmental community. And so while they cannot preserve these forests in the long run, they can destroy all of the jobs that used to exist in the West related to these natural resources, and that they have successfully done. So it's a lose-lose scenario, thanks to the environmental community. And when you read about these fires, if you're living somewhere else, or if you're anywhere in the West and you are experiencing these fires, you can thank an environmentalist for the ecological disaster that we are experiencing. Before I move on from this topic, I should point out that when Teddy Roosevelt created the National Forest System, every national forest has a wilderness component. And for the most part, the math is that 1/3 of the national forests were set aside as wilderness and 2/3 were set aside for recreation and for natural resource extraction. So even for the last 100 years, 1/3 of all the national forests were always wilderness areas in which there has never been any logging, ever. So there are vast stretches of forest land with so-called ancient trees in them. They're out there. I've visited them. They're beautiful. And the idea that the other 2/3 could be on a rotating harvest basis like the private land was just too much for the environmentalists, most of whom got their funding from the East Coast, where people from far away decided to dictate how Westerners should live, which apparently is in poverty. So the Menendez trial, this is Bob Menendez, who is the senator from New Jersey. He's on trial for bribery. A couple of points on this. So prosecutors are seeking to prove that Menendez used his office to obtain visas for this guy, Bushik, and 3 other women on behalf of a gentleman by the name of Solomon Melgen, or Melgen, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, who is a 63-year-old Florida eye doctor. Melgen is a co-defendant in this case. He's a longtime friend of Menendez, and the claim on the prosecutors or the government side is that all of the private airfare and the luxurious vacations that the two of them went on were in exchange for Menendez getting visas for friends and doing all sorts of government business for this guy, who, by the way, was apparently defrauding Medicare to the tune of about $100 million. That's this guy, Melgen. So Menendez's defense is that this has been a longtime friend of his from before he got into the Senate, and that the fact that they take vacations together and he hangs out with him has nothing to do with his job as United States Senator. What I find interesting is how little interest the mainstream media has in this case. Now, he's in New Jersey, the same state where Bridgegate took place around Governor Christie, and the New York Times and the mainstream media, which is when we're talking about national media, is based out of New York City, right next to New Jersey, for those of you who have a map. They were all over the Bridgegate trial, and they never stopped on this constant haranguing of whether or not Chris Christie was involved in all of that. You, by now, have probably figured out that Bob Menendez is a Democrat. And so the mainstream media interest, based out of New York, in this trial in New Jersey is minimal. It's minimal, which is just further proof of the garbage mainstream media in this country that is so obviously biased, but everybody with a brain has figured that out by now. So I want to talk about Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and the GOP Senate. The House passed a budget blueprint the other day that cut non-defense discretionary spending from what is now $554 billion down to $424 billion over the next 10 years. So let me say that again. It's a budget blueprint that they passed that will, over the decade, bring non-defense discretionary spending down. It's not a cut in the increase. It's an actual cut. So right now we spend $544 billion on non-defense discretionary spending. 10 years from now, according to the blueprint, that will be over $100 billion, or 25% less than it is today. This is a massive blueprint for cutting government spending. Now, the House passed that. It's never going to pass in the Senate, and the Senate will do nothing close to that. Wall funding passed in the House. Funding for Trump's wall passed in the House. That's not going to pass in the Senate. My point here is that I am not a fan of Paul Ryan, and I see him for who he is. But if you look at who got right with the election results and attempted to deliver, Trump's nationalist agenda has not been stopped in the House. The House, for the most part, has passed it. I'm not happy with where they are on budget levels and things like that, but they have done a lot, and they are not the problem. So I don't understand why everybody in the blogosphere is pounding away on Paul Ryan, who, again, I don't like, and if he's defeated, great. But it is the Senate where the problem is. It is Mitch McConnell and McCain and a whole bunch of other hoaxing GOP senators who are the actual problem to advancing the Trump agenda. And I think, sadly, that, as we've talked about before, The Senate's in no danger. They're likely to pick up seats, which is why we're concentrating on taking out some of their folks in the primaries. The House is vulnerable, and I believe that thanks to the worthless GOP and the fact that they've been unable to get anything done, it's probably the House that's going to suffer as a result of what the Senate has done. So, in all likelihood, Paul Ryan may lose his speakership. The Republicans there's a decent chance that Republicans will lose the House. Not because of anything they did, but because of what the Senate didn't do. The fact that Republicans could not pass much, and that, again, they're all hanging their hat on Gorsuch getting confirmed, which is something that only the Senate did, and therefore the House has no accomplishments. But again, it's not because the House hasn't passed things, it's because the Senate has made it impossible for the House to have any accomplishments on behalf of the Trump agenda. And so, again, the great irony is that it's the House that may get punished for what the Senate has done. We need to be smarter than that, and we need to concentrate on these senators who are much slicker politicians, and they are much better at remaining above the fray and appearing moderate and neutral and being everybody's best friend. But you can't be tricked by all of those wonderful political techniques that they've used to ascend to the mountaintop. They are, for the most part, phonies, and they have sold us out. Some of them hiding behind McCain and others, because I think everybody understands McCain's likely to pass away, certainly not going to run for re-election in 6 years, and so he could take that vote to kill Obamacare, repeal, and replace, while they all voted for it. But I'm sure behind the scenes there were at least 10 or 15 of them that were very happy that McCain went out and did that for them. I see that Flake is 23 points down in his primary against Ward. That's good news. I also want to toot my own horn because a couple of podcasts ago I told you that Trump had met with some people while he was at the Arizona rally, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was a stronger candidate that got in against Flake in the primary. And I've now read a couple of articles suggesting that that will happen, that a big announcement will come in the next couple of weeks, and that probably, I'm guessing, one of the House members is going to run against Jeff Flake. And we'll just have to assess who that is versus Kelly Ward, but I think that Jeff Flake's days are numbered, and everybody's starting to realize that. If a House member will jump in and challenge him, I think that you're sensing a shift away from Flake and a decision among a lot of core donors and people that he's just not going to survive. So that's good news. I also read an article that said Bob Corker in Tennessee is thinking about not running for re-election. He's seriously considering retiring. Somebody might be looking at how vulnerable he is in a primary, and by somebody I mean Bob Corker himself. This is good news. We need to keep the pressure on. I'd like to see somebody prominent and a Trump supporter announce, because I think that might drive Bob Corker from the field. Or perhaps to go meet with him privately and say, in 10 days I'm going to announce, which gives Corker time to announce a retirement so it doesn't look like he's running away. But however we get him gone, it's nice to get him gone. So the 3 Senate seats that we were looking at, taking out Flake in his primary in Arizona, Dean Heller in Nevada, and Bob Corker in Tennessee, we are seeing some good progress on these 3 scalps that we need. I also see that Bannon and the PAC that he's affiliated with have made it clear they're going to be backing Tarkanian against Heller in Nevada. So this is all good news. I did also see that there was an article about the 2 most recent special elections that have taken place, I believe in New Hampshire, and the other one was in Colorado or Utah, I don't remember. Maybe it was Oklahoma. I just don't remember the other state. But in both cases, the Democrats won the race. What's changed? We defeated them 5 or 6 times after Trump was elected, and now we've lost 2. I'll tell you exactly what's changed. What's changed is the worthless GOP. Nothing depresses your own turnout and drives people in the middle who've been siding with us because they thought we were actually going to get something done. Nothing drives them away than the fact that the GOP has not delivered on nearly anything that has been asked of them this year. So why would people vote for that? Why would they be interested in getting on board that ship when it's going nowhere but in a circle? Meanwhile, the hate Trump brigade is very energized, and they turned out their votes. So I think it portends bad things, as I said, about the House next year, because the Republicans have not accomplished anything. They've done this to themselves. So Bannon gave some interviews to Charlie Rose, which were aired on 60 Minutes on Sunday, and then in a 2-part series on PBS. You can watch all of this online, and I am imploring you, if you want to improve your day and have a delightful television viewing experience, go to your computer, and go to the 60 Minutes website and watch the Bannon interview. And then you can go to charlierose.com and watch the 2-part series that he played on PBS that's on his website as well. Watch them. It is absolutely delightful. It is the most joyous hour and a half, 2 hours that you will experience because Bannon is on fire. And it's just one wonderful quote after another. Doris, what did you think about the interviews?
Oh, it was very illuminating, and I thought that Bannon was able to just shut down Charlie Rose in his manhunt.
And all the globalist crap that he can. At one point, he's like, "You're just in some Davos echo chamber. That's why you're saying that stuff." And I just laughed because it's just great. Bannon is great. And he's obviously going to be heavily involved in races in this next cycle, and I'm excited to see what comes from all of that. But go watch those interviews. You don't need me to recount them here on the podcast. Go experiencing them for yourself. They're an absolute joy.
Just one of the first salvos that Bannon is going to do from his Breitbart high top.
Correct. Back on the immigration subject for a second. This point has been made before, and I just want to reiterate it because I happen to believe it. That there's this idea that there are Americans and then there are citizens. That there are, in this land of 330 million people in this country, a certain number of people who believe in the founding principles and the Constitution and these inherited values that came from Western civilization. And they are of all races and ethnicities. Now, we've talked before about the percentages within those groups, and that's a reality that I didn't create, and it just is what it is, and you need to be aware of the reality among the various cultures as far as how much they support that. But there are what we would call Americans in every group. Race, creed, color, sexual orientation, there are Americans in every group at different levels, different percentages, but there are Americans there. And then we have vast numbers of people in the country who have been referred to, and I agree, are just citizens. In other words, they don't share those values, they don't believe in those core principles of our founding, but they want the welfare state and the privileges and everything that come with being a citizen, what the paper that says they're a citizen provides. And we are a country filled with Americans and citizens. And the point has also been made, and I agree, that all across the world, there are people who want to come here to be citizens, and there are people who want to come here to be Americans. In other words, in India and in Nepal and in China and in the Congo and in Argentina, there are some people there who are in their hearts Americans. And they want desperately to come here to become Americans. And there are in all of those places lots of people who would like to come to America to be a citizen so that they can get access to all of the privileges of being a citizen. And right now, our immigration system, which is chain migration, encourages the growth of the citizen population in our country. It invites in and it gives status to people who simply want to come here to be citizens. And what the RAISE Act that Tom Cotton and the president would have put forward, and when you hear people talk about having a points-based system that has some expectations of people that they're going to come with an occupation, they're going to come with something that they can contribute, that they already speak English, all of these requirements is a search for those people who actually want to come and be Americans. And it is not about whether we're going to have immigration or not. It's about, are we going to have a system that encourages people to come to be citizens and that is out there just basically pulling in citizens? Or are we going to have an immigration system that is out there looking for the Americans and pulls in the people who want to be Americans? We can take a very broad ethnic mix of people in legally under an immigration system that is actually pulling the Americans in. The number of people, let's just put it this way. Yes, there are far more people out there who would be citizens and far fewer people that would be Americans. But we're talking about a world with 6, 7, 8 billion people in it. There are hundreds of millions of people who would be Americans if they were here. And the point is that if we had an immigration system that looked only for those people, It doesn't in the end matter whether we're letting in 100,000 people legally or 1,000,000 people legally. If we are allowing in Americans, if we are searching for, identifying, and then allowing in Americans, not citizens or future citizens, it changes everything. It changes everything. It changes the outcome of votes and all the rest. Again, so when you're looking at a population, let's just pick something at random and take Colombia, okay? And to say, would we want to let all of Colombia into the United States? No, because the vast majority of Colombians would become citizens, not Americans. But there are thousands of people in Colombia who would be wonderful Americans. And the point is, if you had a system that identified them in, you would want to let those Colombians in. So, my point being that it's not about the numbers, although we do need to reduce legal immigration while we have so many people that are not currently in the workforce. But my broader point is that whatever the legal immigration level is going to be, the issue is not the number, it's the kinds of people we are letting in. Not by race or sexual orientation, none of that matters, because there are people in all of those subgroups who would be fantastic Americans. It's a matter of whether or not we're going to have a legal immigration system that searches for them, identifies them, and targets only them.
It's real easy to tell the two groups apart because the citizens are the ones who come here to take by partaking, and the Americans are the ones that believe in our Constitution and want to help make our country even better than it is.
Which brings me to a nice little anniversary that's coming up on the 17th of this month, Constitution Day. It will mark the 230th anniversary of the signing of the American Constitution. Our country is young, but at 230 years, our Constitution is by far the longest-lasting Constitution in human history. We've all noticed that it is not as strong as it was. It has eroded over time. Why has it eroded over time? Well, one answer, I give you a couple, three reasons. One is time itself. I think that constitutions are like a lot of things, like people or cars or houses, they age. And what happens as they age is they grow a little bit more decrepit, and eventually they all die. Not that I'm suggesting the Constitution is a living thing, like a living Constitution. I'm just trying to make the point that time works its will on all things. And like water on rocks, it has worked its will on the Constitution over time. Secondly, I would attribute waves and waves of immigration to eroding the Constitution. And again, it's not about any particular subgroup. It's the fact that in the 19th century and the early 20th century, a lot of the immigration, as a matter of fact, almost entirely, our immigration was based on a labor need. So were we asking the kinds of questions that we needed to determine whether or not people wanted to come to be citizens or whether or not they wanted to come to be Americans? No, we were just letting in people to fill the factories, to meet the labor needs. And that has never really changed. We've never really done a points-based system like Canada and New Zealand and other places do. And so we have let in a lot of people who came to be citizens and not necessarily Americans. And thirdly, I would say you absolutely cannot dismiss the progressive international socialist movement and their systematic century-and-a-half-long efforts to tear at and shred the U.S. Constitution. It has been deliberate. It's been planned out. They have had annual meetings. They have plotted both in private and in public in all of the different ways that they have punched holes in this Constitution over time. She's a beautiful thing. I think of the Constitution kind of like an old ship. It's sort of in danger of sinking at any moment, and you can tell that time has worked its will on an old sailing ship, but there's something still majestic and beautiful when you look at it. You sort of see that in its bones, there's still this great ship there, and it has all this history and done all these wonderful things. That's very similar to the way I think about the Constitution. I hope that you'll all take a moment to read it. I know many of you have. Maybe take this time on this anniversary to find a young person and sit down with them and ask them to read it aloud to you. You could pretend maybe that your eyesight is failing or that for some reason you just need them to read it to you, if that's how you need to trick them into reading the Constitution out loud. But get a young person to read the Constitution, and so that you can listen to it and they can learn it. It's not a very long document, so this little exercise won't take very long at all, but it's very illuminating, and I encourage everyone to do that on this 230th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution. It remains a work of genius and balance. We've talked about this in a previous podcast. If you ask me, I think the worst mistake over its 230-year history was the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators. I think that is when state power really began to erode at a big clip, and when government began to grow, as U.S. senators were more interested in growing their own power, which was federal power, than they were in being servants to the power of states when they used to serve at the pleasure of states. The 17th Amendment is my answer to what's been added to what's the worst thing that's been added to the Constitution. If you ask me what's the worst thing that never got added, I think it's a balanced budget amendment. 49, I believe, of the 50 states have balanced budget amendments in their constitution. Somewhere along the line, the federal government never did that as well, and that is the one truly missing amendment that never happened but should have. It's certainly a famous story that I bet all of you have heard. Benjamin Franklin was coming out of the Constitutional Convention at the end, and a woman who was among the crowd that had been waiting to find out, because it had all been happening in secret, what the result was. She said, "Well, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" And he replied in his droll, witty way, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Ultimately, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are just pieces of paper. The ideas and principles that they contain must reside in the hearts of the people. It's still a social contract, and the Constitution can only truly live and perform at its highest functions if a majority of the people of the country support it. It was interesting that after all the hyperventilating about the Hurricane Irma, she turned out to not be as devastating as everyone predicted. You got to expect that from the news cycles. It was in CNN and Fox News and everyone's interest to hype that thing up, and this BS about a nuclear hurricane is coming, and then they were even pouncing on Rush Limbaugh because he said it wasn't going to be as devastating as they said, and then he had to evacuate, and they were doing a lot of I told you so's, and then it went right past the southern tip of Florida, ended up coming up the west coast, was for the most part a Category 3 most of the time, so it was by no means a nuclear hurricane. It was bad, it did damage, but it wasn't the hurricane to end all hurricanes, and Rush was far more right than they're ever going to admit, because his point was essentially that there's a lot of incentive to overhype these things ahead of time. Although I watched this whole thing, and I will say that all of the tracks, they have a bunch of different models that model where it's going to go. And there are about 20 or 25 of these models. And they put all of the different lines on a map to show you all the different models. And you can kind of sort of see where they cluster. And then there's always a couple of extraneous ones. And there really were only like one or two of the models that had it coming past the tip and going up the west side. And all of the others had it going right up Florida or up the eastern seaboard. And so 95% of the models were wrong. And I'll say that is an argument in favor of the hyperventilating that went on the network side. But on the other side of the argument, it's another example of the certified smart people not being correct. Remember, we went through all of this with the election, in which all of the polling said Donald Trump was going to get blown out. All these people who get paid to do this and to create these models, and the models were worthless. Which just goes to show you how, and I think a lot of people see this, which is where a lot of this anti-elite sentiment comes from. Look at all these people who get paid a lot of money to do stuff that's bullcrap. I mean, all the people involved in the modeling and the polling around the election got paid a tremendous amount of money to produce nothing of any value, because it had zero predictive value. It was all wrong. And then you had all those pundits who are paid six figures, who all said he's going to lose, and they gave all of their technical reasons for why he's going to lose and he can't win, and they were all wrong. They all got paid, but they were all wrong. And this is my problem with Conservative Inc., and all of the people in the conservative movement who go around making the arguments for conservatism, but they never win at anything, and yet they all continue to get paid. There is this frustration with all of these so-called experts and certified smart people and elites who get paid a tremendous amount of money to be smart, and yet they're wrong all the time. So they are not being smart, they're just getting paid. And that's at the core where all of this anti-elite sentiment is coming. And we got another example of it with the hurricanes, because think of how much money was spent on all those models. And they're all run by different outfits, obviously. So you're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars that went into all of these different models, and all but one of them was wrong. So all these certified smart people, again, get paid a tremendous amount of money to be wrong. What is the point?
But if you were one of the people that were in the supposed path of the hurricane and you got out of there and saved yourself, I'm sure that you feel that it was worthwhile being warned.
Except that they evacuated almost the entire southern half of Florida. So if they had known that it was only going to go up the west coast, there's all sorts of people that didn't need to evacuate that did. And that was a tremendous waste of time and money and effort and all of that. Of course, since we know that all the models were essentially wrong, everybody probably should have been evacuated as a precaution. I mean, imagine the scenario where we don't have the models and they just see this big hurricane coming. You evacuate everyone because you don't know where it's going to go. My point is simply that you can do all that without paying millions of people to do models to be wrong.
Oh, you are so correct there. On a more local level, my big boo-boo is all the governments that pay so much money for consultants to tell them what they want to hear that they had already made their mind up about prior.
Oh, it's all a racket. There was a show on Showtime for a few years called House of Lies with Don Cheadle starring as this. He's basically a business consultant. And the best thing about that show was that they were constantly ridiculing the entire consulting industry, because he would look at the camera and sort of wink. And the whole point is that he knew his entire industry was bullcrap. They would go in and make these pitches to businesses, and it was all with all these charts and graphs, and everything sounded great. And they would get these multi-million-dollar contracts, but it was all crap, and they knew it, and he would confess that to the audience, essentially. So the whole point of the show was that this entire industry is worthless, and yet they're all making six-figure salaries and driving nice cars and all the rest. So it was one of the most anti-elitist shows I've ever seen, whether they intended it to be or not, which I think they did. Point is that to indict an entire industry and to say that this thing is hollow, the emperor has no clothes, was huge, and it's part of what's informed a lot of people who are unemployed or underemployed or who work low-wage jobs that they hate. They look at all these people who are in the elite sectors, and they're getting paid very well, and they're living nice lives, but they're not doing anything that actually contributes to society. I mean, it's one thing if a person is an eye doctor or an eye surgeon and he's paid $500,000 a year, but he's actually repairing people's eyes all year long, right? I mean, he's actually doing something. Whereas some business consultant who's convincing a bunch of corporations to give them $10 million contracts, and it's worthless, they're not really doing anything, it's all just a giant hoax. Or as Doris is talking about, a lot of these governments hire consultants to come in and come up with an official report that backs up what they wanted to do in the first place. So in other words, they already know what they want. Everything just drives towards that. It's all just a bunch of pie graphs and charts designed to confirm what they already want to do. That's a bunch of people who get paid enormous sums of money who have no value. They produce no real value. And lots of folks, regular folks, have seen this time and again over the last few decades. They understand this game, even though they're watching it from afar. And it is what has fueled this utter and complete contempt for the elite classes in this country. Well-deserved contempt.
Well, you know what has caused this huge increase in consultants is that people don't have jobs. People that had good paying jobs that now don't have one say, oh, I could be a consultant. And that is what caused it. We've lost our regular producing jobs in favor of opinion.
Yeah, a lot of it is opinion, and it's a lot of back scratching and hoaxing. Essentially, these are all elaborate hoaxes that the consultants are involved in creating a gravitas around, and they've wrecked science, because a lot of what's happened in the last few decades is people using science to further their own political goals, whether it's by funding pseudoscience or funding a lot of science and surveys and research in which you already know what the outcome you want is. It could be a pharmaceutical company, it could be any kind of XYZ corporation, but they already know what they want, and they fund a bunch of research to essentially come to that conclusion, and all of that floods in. The global warming thing is filled with a bunch of pseudoscience as well. And it has eroded, rightfully, people's trust. Look at all of the food science over the last 40 years. It's claimed that eggs, potatoes, milk, something is bad for you, or it's going to cause cancer, some bullcrap. And then within 10 or 15 years, they admit that none of that was true. We've had so many reversals on food science in the last 50 years that it's laughable now when anybody comes out with something claiming some food might not be good for you. I just ignore it because it's so full of crap. But there's been all sorts of cancer studies claiming XYZ causes cancer, and that stuff's had to be reversed over time. Tremendous amount of damage done to the peer review process, where there's been example after example of the fact that that's a lot of collusion and people peer reviewing each other's stuff to scratch each other's backs. All these people trying to get doctorates, and so they're all forced to do a doctoral dissertation, but there aren't enough real things to do doctoral dissertations on, so you've got just the world filled with crappy, unread doctoral dissertations out there, all of which has brought the confidence level in science way, way down, because it is just filled with crap and pseudoscience and back-scratching and nonsense. And then you got lefties saying, oh, it's a bunch of religious people who don't believe in science. That is not what has gone on over the last couple of decades. Science and scientists and the entire community have ruined themselves with a glut of money and hubris. And they've brought themselves to this low state. But they're just one sector in this overall elite implosion that has occurred in our country. Well-deserved, about time, and you're right to be skeptical of all of this. And a lot of people are very skeptical of all of this crap. I mean, you open up the newspaper, and about half of what you read is probably based or in some way sitting on top of manure.
Exactly.
There are so much that is just false or a hoax or agenda-driven or flat biased. It's probably closer to 80% of what you're reading in the paper, but it's just, and when I say the paper, I mean, go to any website. It doesn't have to be the actual local newspaper. What I'm saying is that there's just so much crap behind all of the information that floats out there. And within that is 10 to 15, 20% of information that's true and real and valuable. And the hard part is trying to sift through the manure for the diamonds.
And don't you wish that our schools were teaching the students to discern?
Of course, the assumption in that question is that what's happened in the schools, which is the exact opposite, is somehow accidental. There hasn't been some deliberate decision or plot on the part of a lot of people in that progressive socialist movement to dumb it all down. So Doris does not do scary movies, so I went with a friend of ours to see It, the horror film that's out in the theaters. It's making a ton of money. This is basically Goonies meets Freddy Krueger. So the horror side is Nightmare on Elm Street, basically, and the characters and all of that is much more on the Goonies side, because it's about a bunch of kids and they have to sort of save their town by working together, and they ridicule each other, and there's a lot of funny lines. So in that way, it's very much like Goonies. I thought the movie was fine. When I go to a horror movie, I expect it to scare me, and I've seen a lot of horror movies. So if you're just going to rehash a lot of the same kind of tricks of the trade, the camera that hovers off to the side and then allows the scare to come in from the left or the right, that stuff's just so old, it's been done, that it's not going to work with me. It usually every year or two, maybe 3 or 4, I will see one scary movie that I actually like because it's original and it's creepy in some way, and I felt like, they've really done something here I haven't seen before. This was not it. The person I went with was very scared, and she had a good time, but I was just watching it, and I was a little bit entertained by the interaction between the kids. The production values were very good. It looked very good. But as far as, if you've seen a lot of scary movies and you enjoy them, I don't think you're going to be particularly impressed by this. I would essentially give it a B.
The last scary movie that I saw that was worth anything was Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, that's a pretty effective movie. Almost not really a horror film, really more of a thriller, but more affecting. Absolutely. I mean, there were some Hannibal Lecter's famous now as a villain and very creepy. And it's amazing what you can do with just a few scenes that are very creepy, rather than a movie in which you're just kind of constantly throwing scary things at the camera, hoping to get that sort of jump back reaction from the audience. I mean, it's old, it's tired, it's been done. We're 100 years into making movies. And if you're just going to do paint by number stuff with a new coat of paint, I have lost interest in that. Also, this weekend, as we said on the last podcast, 35th anniversary of The Wrath of Khan, Doris and I went to see Ricardo Montalban and William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy and all of the rest in The Wrath of Khan. Doris does not remember the first time she saw this movie, which was probably 35 years ago, so it was really fresh for her. Doris, what did you think?
It made me appreciate not only the writing, but how great the actors were. I mean, when I think back, I don't think of it as an actor's film, but after seeing Wrath of Khan, it really brought that home to me.
It's hard to pull apart acting from writing, because it's easy to say they were better actors and that today's actors aren't as good. Probably true, but they're not. I mean, today's actors aren't given the material that would bring out their skills if they're there. You're right. I mean, what's noticeable over time is the fall off in the writing. I refer to the original Star Trek episodes as Shakespeare in space. And Doris and I were talking about this earlier. The reason why back then you could have a show like Star Trek, it was so well written and would reference Western canon, is because the men, and some women, but mostly men, but it doesn't matter, men or women, the people who were writing these shows were coming out of colleges in the 40s and 50s and 60s. That's when they had gotten their degrees, before the Western canon had been eviscerated from the liberal arts education. So these are people who had read Milton and Dante and they probably read all of Shakespeare and were required to, in classes, to read all of these dead white men. They probably all read the Bible. Even if they weren't necessarily believers, they had read the Bible. And so they were so well versed in all of the Western canon, all of the famous books, hundreds and hundreds of really, this collection of Western thought, Plato and Cicero and all of the rest, so that it comes out in their writing, not only in direct quotes, but oftentimes the plots are structured around some of the structures of these famous stories. I mean, The Wrath of Khan is a Moby Dick story. It is in many ways sort of retelling of Melville's Moby Dick. And there are lines in the movie directly pulled from Moby Dick. And these old stories are so wonderful and so rich that when they're reformed into these TV plots or movie plots, they're just deeper and better than the kind of crap that is written now. And remember that today's writers are, got their college degrees in the 70s and 80s and 90s or in the aughts, in which those books have been completely removed from the liberal arts education. So, they're reading social justice warrior books and Alice Walker, not to knock her too much, but I mean, just stuff that's been written in the last 45 years, that the quality of which is nowhere near as good. So the writers don't have that background. They haven't been exposed to all of that rich Western civilization, all those texts. And so they don't have as many tools to bring to the writing when they do it.
And all the advancements like phasers and communication devices, we wondered at that time if those things would ever come true, but we really kind of believed that they would.
Yeah, they pretty much warp drive and the Energizer is the only thing that hasn't happened. I mean, there have been a lot of articles. This is not a new observation, but a lot of the things that we've seen in the old Star Trek movies have come to be. Now, there's this great chicken and egg argument of, did Star Trek really predict those things? Were they savants? Or did all of today's computer and mechanical engineers grow up as Trekkies watching all of that, and so their overall ambition was to create those things? And so the reason, and I think it's more the latter. I mean, the reason the original cell phones, well, not the very original ones, because those were bricks, but very quickly in the 90s, remember, we all had flip phones?
Yes.
That was not an accident. I mean, the people who designed those phones were Trekkies, and they wanted the phones to look like, like communication devices out of Star Trek. So it is a mixture of them accurately predicting where the technology was going, but also the technology has in some cases taken the shape of Star Trek devices because the people who designed and created them are huge Trekkies. And, if I'm going to make a cell phone, why wouldn't I make a cell phone that looks just like, the device that Kirk used? So it's a bit of both, and that's amusing as well. It was fun. It reminds me of, it was a reminder of just how much fluff and crap there is in the theaters today. To go and watch a movie that's 35 years old that is better than 85% of what they're putting out now. Shameful. I also noticed last week I made the point about watching Hollywood films and TV shows with your brain turned on, about the fact that there's a subtext and there are always leftward messages being pushed on you. And then I come across this article, just simply confirm my genius, that some political scientists at the University of Notre Dame have concluded that watching sentimental films can have a greater influence on a person's political opinions than watching advertising or news reports, because, of course, you are much more aware that the news and advertisers are actually trying to sell you something, and you think less about it when you are watching TV and movies. That's when you tend to turn your brain off and just give yourself over to wherever they want to take you. And the point is that, viewers are not prepared to be critical about what they're seeing on the screen, and they're more likely to experience a leftward shift in attitudes when watching Hollywood movies. Now, if you're curious about how this study was done, essentially they would survey these folks before they would show them a film, and then they would show films that had liberal messages, like The Rainmaker with Matt Damon or As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson. They would show those kinds of movies, and then they had sort of neutral films they felt like didn't have as much of a message, and then they would resurvey right afterwards the people who'd watched the films, and they noticed a leftward shift in the politics of the people who'd watched the more left-leaning movies, including among conservatives. So it just confirms what I was trying to tell you all last week, which is not to say that you shouldn't go out and experience art or enjoy art, but you have to bring the same critical faculties to that you would to watching a Budweiser commercial or a news program. We're all aware that the news is biased. If you are trapped in an airport and the only thing you can watch is CNN, you know immediately that you got to turn your filter on and that you got to sift through the bull crap to try to maybe glean a little bit of actual news from what CNN is putting out there. We all are aware of that. You have to bring those same faculties to watching television shows and movies. So we are just about out of time, and you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow, so please share this podcast with your very best friend. They'll thank you forever. You are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.